You know, obviously, you're hearing the headlines. We were talking earlier, NBC reporting about rank and file members of the House really wanting to revisit the issue of impeachment. Where do you stand on that, and what are the pros and cons?
Well, the Founding Fathers have made clear that impeachment should be a question of last resort, not a question of first resort. And so my view remains the same, consistent with the standard that our Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, has articulated, which is that the case must be compelling, the evidence should be overwhelming, and sentiment around impeachment should be bipartisan in nature. Yes, we should continue our focus to serve as a check and balance consistent with our constitutional responsibilities on an out-of-control executive branch. But we should do so methodically and carefully as we proceed. The overwhelming majority of...
One quick follow-up, though, to what you just said. I mean, what could be more compelling than what we have seen in this presidency? I don't want to list the compelling possibilities for impeachable offenses because it would take too long. Are we overlooking our nose in front of our face when we're talking about norms and laws that are being broken or stretched to the limits?
Well, no person is above the law, not even the President of the United States or the so-called Attorney General. And so we are going to take that constitutional responsibility that we have as a separate and co-equal branch of government seriously. Chairman Nadler has indicated that we will conduct hearings on obstruction of justice. We will conduct hearings on abuse of power. We will conduct hearings on the culture of corruption that exists. But we need to do so methodically. So that means making sure we can get the full and unredacted Mueller report, because we can't trust the Attorney General's redactions. He's proven himself to be a fixer for Donald Trump, not the people's Attorney General. We need to get the underlying documentation, which is what we've requested in the context of the subpoena, and we need to hear from Bob Mueller himself. We're working to make that happen.
Casey.
Congressman, just to follow up on this, I mean, I take all your points about, the process, and you all have been very deliberate about all of that, but it is starting to look in the aggregate as though you can't get the Trump administration to give you or do anything. I mean, how do you convince Americans that your strategy is actually going to work? And what is the strategy in the courts to try and force the Trump administration to comply?
Well, first of all, our strategy is to deliver on the promises that we've made to the American people in connection with our For the People agenda. That's our overall strategy. We promise that we're going to lower health care costs.
Right, but you've issued subpoenas on a whole host of topics. I mean, you've got tax returns, you've gone after the security clearance issue, not to mention Bob Mueller, Don McGahn, all these other things. It's clearly a priority. How do you demonstrate to people that you're actually going to get someplace?
So I was home last week. And I had a Congress on Your Corner event. I was on a street corner for 3 hours in East New York, and not a single person brought up the question of tactics and strategies related to impeaching Donald Trump or holding him accountable. So the first thing is to point out that the American people want us to uphold our promises to lower health care costs, protect people with pre-existing conditions, strengthen the Affordable Care Act. And as you know, that's exactly what we're doing this week with legislation that's going to be on the floor tomorrow. That said, we have taken a step toward holding this administration accountable in the face of its defiance as it relates to the contempt of Congress citation that was voted out of the House Judiciary Committee last week. We expect that sometime in the near future that will come to the floor, and then we'll have to enforce that contempt citation. And we believe that the case law and the jurisprudence will stand on our side.
So, Congressman, I just want to follow up on that, because it's obvious now that the White House has adopted a strategy of trying to bait the Democrats into impeachment. They're going to deny you everything, witnesses and documents, ignore the subpoenas, fight everything in court, and they want this fight. Is there any danger for Democrats, do you think, in fighting the fight to have normal oversight, to get these documents and witnesses? And if that fails, are you prepared to initiate proceedings for impeachment?
Well, it certainly is important, consistent with upholding the rule of law and the fact that we have a system of checks and balances to make sure that we have a robust oversight function that continues to proceed in Congress. Over the last 2 years, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, unfortunately, conducted themselves like wholly owned subsidiaries of the Trump administration. And the reality is the House, as a separate and co-equal branch of government, doesn't work for Donald Trump. We work for the American people. So we do have to proceed. But we can't overreach. We can't over-politicize. We can't over-investigate. But we should proceed aggressively, and I'm confident that that's what Chairman Nadler and Chairman Cummings and Chairman Richie Neal are going to do.
Hey, Congressman, you just alluded to something that is kind of universal, I think, in this country. Congress on the corner. You live close enough to the corners, to the street corners in Brooklyn and Queens, that you get home a lot. So I want to ask you, how often is it that you bump into the combination of exhaustion and frustration with everything that's happening in Washington, and people who look you in the eye and say, what do you people do down there? How do you handle that?
Well, there is a great deal of frustration in terms of the impression that all that happens in Washington, D.C. is sort of conflict and, of course, the chaos, crisis, and confusion
Isn't that the
comes
case?
out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue every day. But let me say, you know, one of the things that I'm often able to point out is that Congress is trying to work together, led by House Democrats. Last year, we were able to come together and pass historic criminal justice reform. We worked with Jared Kushner and the administration. Congressman Doug Collins, my good friend, a conservative Republican from rural Georgia, led the effort on the Republican side, and I worked with members on the House Democratic side to get things done. We're proceeding to do the same exact thing on lowering the high cost of life-saving prescription drugs and dealing with the anti-competitive practices of the pharmaceutical companies, as well as on infrastructure. And when I explain that and talk about our forward-looking agenda to deal with kitchen table pocketbook issues, that puts my constituents often at ease.